Hello everyone, this is Matt the Vinyl Minimalist. Today's video will be different. We will talk about anatomy of a vinyl record, and by anatomy I do not mean just describing parts of a record. We're going to dissect the records. We're going to talk about the parts of the record from the point of view of a vinyl fan, a vinyl lover, well, from my personal point of view, of course. Now, I find this is very interesting because vinyl records are not just a standard medium. They're just not there to carry sound and nothing else. They are quite a complete piece of art. So that's why I want to talk about this in detail. I've got a few notes, so I will be looking down all the time probably, so don't be disturbed by that. First, a few things that make records very special. In my opinion, in my point of view, a record is a time and space traveler. It is a witness of past times and lost places. And it brings back the society that has long been gone. And this makes records very, very special. And as an example of this, I'm going to show a very well-known jazz work, a very well-known Blue Note record, Cool Struttin by Sonny Clark. So let's dissect this record. The first thing that grabs your attention, of course, obviously, is the design. It's the artwork of the cover. So we have first the photograph that I personally love. I think this is an absolutely gorgeous photograph. And at the same time we have the very bold typography and the very unique name. And these three together create already a piece of art. In my terms, you can just put the record itself out and throw it away, and the cover, the outer sleeve, still is a piece of art. And it brings back the society that existed in New York in the 1950s, the late 1950s, when this record was made. Maybe it was the mid 1950s, frankly I don't know. In any case, you see the fashion of the past times, you see the cars, you get the feeling. It's not only the music that transports you back to that period and to that place, it's also the photograph, and it's also the typography that nowadays would not exist in this way. Yeah, it's a witness of a lost time, of a past time, and of a place that geographically still exists, but it's not the same place anymore. And with this record, you yourself can be kind of a time traveler and go back. So it starts with the cover, with the design. And what I like a lot about especially jazz records, and especially jazz records of the 1950s and 60s, are the liner notes. And I find liner notes important. You've got plenty of information. Not always liner notes are interesting, frankly. Sometimes I've got a few records with very poor written liner notes. Sometimes it's only one paragraph that doesn't tell you anything. But Blue Note records, liner notes usually give you plenty of information and plenty of stories. And already by reading the notes, knowing a little bit of background and seeing, or also knowing some background of the photograph, you get the whole myth created around this single record. So we've got Sonny Clark, who unfortunately died at a very young age. This was, as far as I know, his last record, in a case as a leader. And that already makes for a story, and this story is almost accessible before you get to the record itself. And many of you will know that the lady or the lady's legs on the photograph belong to Ruth, who would later become Ruth Wolf, the wife of Francis Wolf, who was the founder of Blue Note Records, which is another fascinating story, actually. And all that before you get to the record. So we've got the design, we've got the album name, we've got the liner notes, and that's the visual experience. At the same time, you already have a certain physical experience that also tells you a lot about a certain time and about a certain culture. This is a Japanese pressing of Cool Strutting. I think it's the first Japanese pressing from the early 70s, I guess 1972. And so now it's the time to take the record out. And the insert. Now, I do not understand and I cannot read any Japanese, but to me it looks like it must be the same, very probably now you can see it, probably the very same text in Japanese. Well, to my personal use, well, I cannot really use it, but what you can see is, or what I can see personally, is the love that the Japanese put into the reissue of this record. The cardboard used is fairly sturdy, which, okay, it was rather common in the 1970s, but in Japanese represses, even from the 1980s, quite often you've got the sturdy cover, which was not always the case in America and in Europe in the 1980s, which really shows you the love of the Japanese. It's really well made. The cover is glossy. It's a high quality cover, but at the same time it's not too glossy. And you really feel the love of this Oriental culture for the Western culture, which is frankly amazing. And one reason for which I really like older albums, by that I mean everything that was issued before the CD era, and for me that's basically, well, all the way until the late 1980s. It's a piece of history, and this history, well, it's a piece of, it's old, because you can read it's the Japanese pressing, it's the old pressing, but at the same time you can feel it's an old pressing. You can smell it, you see the blemishes, you see the flaws. This one is actually in fairly good shape. The corners are a bit, you've got the bumps at the corners, but other than that it's really in a good shape. But quite often you've got, for example, people who would write their names on the records, or people who would write the time of the tracks behind the tracks. or sometimes with jazz albums, I've seen that the owner wrote the date when the music was recorded on the back sleeve, which I find actually great. You see that this record was pre-loved, that there was someone already who cared about that music before you, which makes the legacy of that music even greater. Yeah. Okay, so we had the visual experience, we've got the physical experience, and now we come to the record itself. I'm sure there are plenty of things that I omit. I'm not going to talk about inner sleeves, so there are plenty of other things that I do not talk about, but you now get the idea what I'm trying to say, I hope. So yeah, you've got the record, you see the scratches and see the warps, which of course is not the great part about it. This one again is in fairly good shape, so there are no scratches, there are no warps. You see immediately the label, and when I was a kid, when I would listen to my records with fairy tales, with stories for children, back in you can say communist or early post-communist Czechoslovakia, the labels would be very, very boring. They were just one color with plain text written on them. Maybe the Soviet, the Russian pressings with their labels, quite boring, and that's how it is. Well, in the West, there was a label design, and that is really interesting in my point of view. Of course, regarding Blue Note, there's a whole science going on about the labels and which label was issued when and which label sounds good, which label goes with the record that sounds good, and so on. Well, but that's a culture on its own, or a subculture on its own. The Blue Note label is very distinguishable. Frankly, personally, I do not like the design of the Blue Note label, but I became used to it because you see that design just over and over and over again. There are some other records with really cool labels, and I think it's really great to have a record with a nice label. It brings again one little piece to the whole experience. Okay. I didn't mention the weight and the color of the record. Now, I don't really care about the color. Well, to be honest, I guess I even prefer black colored records because I think that's the way it should be. But okay, there are some fancy colored ones. Why not? Yeah. And then there's the weight of the vinyl of the record. This one is not very sturdy, and again, it doesn't really matter as long as you don't let it somewhere in a hot place in a car with bright sun shining on it, and that it could warp or whatever. It doesn't really matter. At the same time, if you get a nice 1950s press, really heavy one, a thick board of a record, that's quite nice too. Good. And then we have dead wax information. So in this area where there is no music. Now it's been only maybe a year that I started actually reading what is inside this dead wax information. It's when I realized, when I read on the internet, that the original Blue Note records are supposed to have the P for plastilite, for the factory where they were pressed. And sometimes you can really find some good and useful information in the dead wax too. Sometimes you've got just some funny texts inside, some kind of jokes. And here, for example, it was just today that I had a look in the dead wax to prepare for the video, and I found some useful piece of information, which is BST 81588, and that is the catalog number, the original catalog number of Cool Struttin of the album. Now, one thing I do not like about this Japanese edition is that they gave a Japanese catalog number to it, and I don't care about the Japanese catalog number, but I do care about the original catalog number. And I thought it was not there, it was not to be found there. Well, it is to be found on the record, which is cool if you have a look. And well, then you have the original catalog number. That's great. Good. Well, and then eventually you put the record on and you enjoy the music, which is also an important part of the whole experience. And then there's recording and mastering quality, but that's kind of obvious, and that's not the purpose of this video. There are some other channels that talk a lot about the quality of music. Good. So this is how I perceive records, how I perceive vinyl LP records, and there are just so many different facets regarding this piece of collective effort, and I find that amazing, and this is the reason why I keep collecting records. That's it for tonight. I hope you have a nice day. Bye bye.